I'm Shaun Jillions with Deckert Jillions LLP. A lot of familiar faces in the room, but for those of you who don't know me, I've had the pleasure of representing the Oregon Association of Realtors for a little over a decade. Attorney in private practice, but specialized just in government relations work. And so I've had the opportunity to work with Dave for, well over a decade now too. We both had a lot more hair, a little less of us. And certainly our beards weren't gray when we started, but I feel terrible. I was originally supposed to be first. I had another meeting that ran late, and I was going to open it with, I feel terrible to start this meeting off on such a bad note. I'm going to finish with, I feel terrible starting this off or ending this on such a bad note. Most stories you like to have a happy ending. I'm going to jump right to the punchline. There is no happy ending on this one. If you're waiting for me to have good news in this presentation, unfortunately, I don't think there's going to be a lot of it, which is disappointing, but it's sort of telling of the political makeup of our state and the influence that, as we sit here in Clackamas County, that Multnomah County and the city of Portland have on the remainder of the state. For any folks who listen to sports talk radio, Colin Cowherd always has a where Colin was right, where Colin was wrong. I was going to do a quick little where Honeycutt was right, where Honeycutt was wrong on there. The only thing I was going to add on a couple of things. Urban and rural reserves, I actually went to the oral argument yesterday before the Oregon Court of Appeals. So we are moving a little bit quicker with that one. I think Dave's timeline's probably pretty accurate about when we get a decision though. Last time it was 13 months afterwards. And they were really pushing on the court, primarily because of our legislative efforts to come out with that decision. You're probably looking at another year now from oral argument. That, as Dave mentioned, would put Clackamas and Multnomah back in limbo. For those of you who followed along in the process at all, that 100-page decision that kicked it back down that said you screwed everything up, the cities and counties took that very seriously and adopted the exact same thing that they did the first time and sent it right back up. So we'll see where they end up. Okay, but on to the pleasant topic of rent control, landlord-tenant rights, where we're headed in the 2019 session. This is a very normal thing for those of you who live around the Portland region to see protests in the street. We've seen a lot of it around housing now. This is a pretty common occurrence for us in the Capitol as well. Folks coming in, sort of chanting more housing now, beating on drums, and it really has sort of set the tone for what we're looking at in 19. So I was going to go over first what sort of the current law is if you're a landlord in the room. Standard disclosure, this is not legal advice from me. I'm simply giving you a presentation. If you ever have any questions, Mitch Teal, consult your own attorney. But what we'll see is there's sort of two organs right now as far as landlord-tenant law goes. I think we're going to be seeing the bigger push to go to one organ, a unified sort of set of laws. And unfortunately for everyone else not in Portland, there's going to be a strong push to push what the city of Portland has adopted. The legislative makeup, certainly the election did not do us any favors. You could go back even before November. We had a senator from actually just up north, up the 205 a little bit in the Happy Valley area, Rod Monroe. Rod Monroe is a former teacher, had spent 35 years in elected office, had been a reliable Democratic vote. No one would ever consider Rod Monroe a moderate senator. He had the audacity to oppose rent control because he owned an apartment building, which was his retirement fund with he and his wife. And the public employee unions immediately turned on him, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars against him, and got him unelected from office over a bill that he never even took a vote on. And really had nothing to do with what the unions claimed to be their core mission. Okay, so current tenant protections. Obviously, landlord-tenant issues have been an issue we've been dealing with for a while. This isn't a new problem as far as vacancy rates being incredibly low. Dave mentioned sort of the shortage of units that we're at. We had a particular shortage coming out of the recession of multifamily units. And so you really sort of saw this increased push from our side to increase supply to drive down costs. From their side, you had an increased push for regulatory solutions to drive down costs or to cap costs. On Monday, we had a summit of most of the elected leaders in Oregon, about 1,000 business folks and lobbyists at the Oregon Convention Center. And they were talking about all the multifamily that's been developed in Portland over the last couple of years. And at the very end, they said, and rental rates have gone down 3% in the city of Portland, something you haven't really heard on the news at all. Rental rates have actually gone down. And one of the affordable housing advocates, being snarky as I usually am, I texted him and I said, wow, this is a novel economic theory. You increase supply and the demand will go down. Someone could win a Nobel Prize by presenting this theory. He, of course, responded back and said if we had better inclusionary zoning, we would have solved the problem too. So always looking at the regulatory environment. I would say, actually, his comment was somewhat correct, even though he didn't realize it. In a compromise, we finally agreed to allow certain large cities on larger developments to implement inclusionary zoning. City of Portland being the primary example of that. We sort of had some trade-offs of what we got in the political makeup. That did actually significantly drive up the supply of multifamily units. And the reason it did is we put it a year out when it would go into effect, and every single developer rushed in to try and get underneath the inclusionary zoning mandate. So we saw a bunch of units in the pipeline that probably would have been a couple years out had we not put that in. As of last count, the city of Portland had 4 developments total under the inclusionary zoning program, all 4 by the same developer. In exchange for increasing the number of affordable units he put in his units, he has no parking associated with it. That was his trade-off, and that's how he made it pencil. I'm sure the neighbors are going to love that. I yesterday was cutting through Selwood. I don't know if you guys know where Selwood is, but someone else had the audacity in Selwood to build a 4-story multifamily unit, and they've graffitied all over it saying 3 stories is enough. So the neighbors, the bananas, the NIMBYs, are upset about the fact it's 4 stories. Oh, by the way, it has no parking either. So those folks there are going to be delighted when everyone's parked in their driveways and across their driveways. So after the 2016 legislative session, we had sort of seen the writing on the wall that there was going to be this big push for tenant protections. And we went to Republicans who were in the minority at that point in time, not quite as heavily as they're going to be next time, and said, you all have to sort of have a package of your own. We're going to get steamrolled if you don't have something that you can present to folks to say that you actually care about the issue too. And vacancy rates aren't just a city of Portland thing. The city of Bend had some of the most historically low vacancy rates, due primarily to the fact they hadn't expanded their UGB in 20 years and they didn't have any buildable supply, but still. So it was sort of what could you do? And the negotiated compromise we came up with was you were going to have to give 90 days notice for rent increases, which if you're renting a couple of units should be standard practice anyway. We didn't think that was as big of a hardship. The one that was really a compromise to go with is for month-to-month tenancies, the first year you can't raise the rent. So that was sort of what they stood on and said, all right, we'll say that you can't raise the rent in the first year. You sign a month-to-month tenant, and after that, you got to give 90 days notice if you're going to increase the rent. The trade-off was there's no cap on what you can increase rents, which is exactly what we'll be looking at eventually. And the other trade-off was we got to keep what's called no-cause evictions. So no-cause evictions are effectively you as a landlord have a set period of time where you can tell the tenant, you need to be out, this just isn't working out. You can't do it for any illegal purpose like you're discriminating against someone, but you effectively just say, this is not working out, you need to move on. I'm giving you, in most cases, 60 days because most of these tenants have been in for a year. There's been a huge push to eliminate no-cause evictions. And a lot of landlords, well, there's sort of 2 fronts on this. A lot of landlords only utilize those ones when they have a problematic tenant, but they don't necessarily want the other tenants of the building to be in danger because of the problematic tenant. So it's, X neighbor and Y neighbor complained about the new individual or the individual who's been there a while, rather than saying, by the way, your neighbors hate you, I'm doing a for-cause notice, you simply do a no cause, you don't jeopardize those existing tenants there. That's been a huge push to eliminate that. And so we've sort of had to figure out, how do we balance that? We've offered suggestions about, rather than true for-cause, which means the tenant really screwed up, did something wrong, didn't pay rent, destroyed property, etc., which likely is going to end up in court to finally get him out, and no cause where you don't state anything, creating sort of a just cause category of things like you're renovating the unit and they need to be out, or additional criteria that could be in there. Thus far, we haven't made it there, so it really is just the battlegrounds of, okay, we're doing no cause, or we're doing for cause, and that's it. Next thing up there, relocation payments. So we'll get to where City of Portland is and why I mentioned that. Strong push to say, landlord, you must pay your tenant when they leave so that they can go somewhere else. I know. And it goes back a little bit, too, to the question about short-term rentals. Where's our balance between private property rights and impacts on others, too, right? I mean, I get both sides of that short-term rental argument, but when you have someone who purchased a beach house that was able to rent it out, and now all of a sudden Lincoln City's going to come say you can't do it anymore, even though you penciled it in that that's how you were going to make money, was doing those nightly rentals. There's that side versus the neighbor who's lived there for 30 years who says it's like a frat house, I hate everyone coming there. It really is sort of a balancing there. So we're trying to figure that out. But I will tell you that the folks picketing don't feel like there's any balance that's needed. A number of their signs are, housing is a human right, greed, no profits. Every landlord is rich and has the means to pay them whatever they need. Another argument I got in for considerable time was, I should have owned that place. I paid the mortgage for years by paying my rent. It really is sort of the paradigm that they see when, as you all know, most landlords in the state are not giant corporations. They're small, own a few units. For the realtors in the room, whenever someone asks, well, why do the realtors care so much about this? I say, where do you think their retirement plans are? Realtors are in real estate. What they do for their retirement is buy rental units to generate an income so hopefully they can retire at some point and stop listening to my speeches. Not you, though. And last but not least, in the mid-90s, we were able to get a preemption on rent control, which effectively says that no local government can implement rent control programs. And that has been a strong push by the legislature to repeal that preemption or to put in statewide rent control. So the city of Portland was not happy about the preemption, and they were not happy that the legislature didn't take stronger methods. And they had an individual by the name of Chloe U. Daly get elected to office, who is currently a renter, and took a very strong stand. She's very closely aligned with a group called Portland Tenants United, which is a very aggressive group that, when Rod Monroe, for instance, was running, picketed him at his house, picketed him at his church. They're really a classy group of individuals. And they sort of came in with, we're going to drive a new agenda, we're going to challenge the state statute on rent control. And so, as I'm blocking some folks, sorry. What they put in basically is no cause notices are still allowed in the city of Portland, and rent increases are still allowed in the city of Portland. But if you issue a no cause notice, you have to pay relocation payments. And if you raise the rent by 10% or more, you have to pay relocation payments if the person leaves. Even better, under the Portland ordinance, let's say you raise the rent by 15%, you pay the person the $4,500 that's up there to leave, they decide they don't want to leave, there's no mechanism for you to get the money back. And the commissioner who brought this in said, well, landlords can afford to do that. And then her second statement was, well, we'll just trust people to give it back. Why would they not? So that's sort of what we're dealing with in the paradigm of reality. And quite frankly, Dave and I do a lot of time in Salem. Thankfully, we don't have to go to City Hall very often, particularly not City of Portland. I did have to go to City of Portland for this. I have never seen a commissioner so vitriolic and denigrating to people coming to testify, and they were all small mom and pop landlords. This wasn't me up there. I don't care if she yells at me. She did blame me for causing the entire housing crisis. So George, there you go. I have that sort of power. But she was so dismissive and so demeaning to folks. And Portland Tenants United hissed at everyone and yelled during the hearing. It really was absolutely the worst form of government I've seen. And ultimately they adopted this. I had the opportunity to testify with a gentleman who had moved out of state to take a job. And he was back there for 2 years. He had rented out his house during that time. And he was moving back because he lost the job into his own home that he owned. He had given a 60-day notice as required by law, and it was on day 58, and they were doing an emergency enaction of the ordinance. And so in order to move back into his own home after losing his job, he was going to have to come up with $4,500 that day with 2 days notice. We managed to prevail on one of the commissioners who you would never expect that perhaps we should have an exception for one unit, primarily for owners coming back in. They've since repealed that too, but we got it in for about 6 months. But that was sort of the hardship that they faced, and they did not care. And actually, Commissioner E. Daly was extremely upset that we got that exception put in. Here's another beauty in it, and you'll see it's in the bills that came in. If you choose not to renew a lease, that's considered a no-cause eviction. So you give someone 1 year lease, at the end of the lease it expires. No, they still have every right in the world to the property under the law. You have to pay them $4,500 or $2,900 if it was a studio. When asked where those numbers came from, they pulled them out of thin air. Thin air is the polite version in a mixed company. It was literally one office, pick these numbers, and that's what you have to do. So we joined with Multifamily Northwest, which is a large apartment association. We sued the city saying it was a violation of the state rent control preemption. We lost at circuit court. We're now up at the Court of Appeals. I think we have oral argument scheduled for next month, so we'll see where that heads. In the meantime, and this is sort of what happened last time, the circuit court judge issued a decision right after we killed the rent control preemption in the legislature, because if that preemption went away, our entire case went away. And so I'm sure it was just conveniently timed that it was the exact same day they declared the bill dead. If one were skeptical, you would think it was sort of coordinated. We're at the Court of Appeals. Oh, this is one other, I just pulled this morning. So that headline right there about the Portland ordinance being model, that's from LA Times. So it's sort of national news how great our ordinance is at protecting folks and that we should expand that. Okay, what's the problem with rent control? Well, there's two good stories on that. One, I was meeting with the speaker who is the primary proponent of this, and we were sort of discussing some other issues, including urban and rural reserves and land use, and she said, well, you know, Shaun, if I'm gonna do you this favor, I really need a vote from you. And I said, there's no way we're supporting rent control. It's absolutely a third rail. We will not go there. And she said, Shaun, it's not rent control, it's rent stabilization. I said, oh my gosh, why didn't you tell me? We would have supported rent stabilization. That's totally different. They've changed the name because rent control was so unpopular in the 70s and 80s and was pretty much preempted around the country. And the reasons being that economists rarely agree on anything, much like lawyers, but almost universally they agree rent control has been a dismal failure. So they have to rebrand it as something else. Now it's rent stabilization. It's modernized. It's still the exact same controls, telling people what they can raise their rents or not, putting an artificial cap on them. And we sort of look at what the problems are. There's one economist in Berkeley, shocking, who flew up And so that's when I'm sort of pushing back on the speaker. I say, you found the one economist. You can't keep just saying that people agree on this. What does rent control historically do? This is historical data. This isn't Shaun and Dave making it up on a napkin. We do a lot of that, by the way, in case you picked up on that, but these are real facts. What it historically has done is completely stifled new development. There's simply no way with capped rents that people are going to invest the money that they need to recoup in order to build the multifamily units, particularly large multifamily complexes, under a rent control system. And so you look at that, it stifles the new development. It actually harms the very people you're trying to help, because in order to make up for damage and losses that occur in rentals under a restricted system, you have to charge significantly more in deposits. So people who are having a hard time getting into a unit in the first place are now facing double and triple the deposit in order for the landlord to recoup, because if they're capped at 2% and their property taxes go up 5% and someone damages the unit, as we all know, they're not rich enough to just eat those costs, and those have to be passed on. So it limits development, it limits mobility, because people stay in those rent capped units and they stay for long periods of time when they're the beneficiary. What it does also is the non-restricted units, so newer units or units that aren't subject to it, the price goes up because you've limited the supply of those, and landlords are going to raise the prices. So increased rents, less supply, less mobility, sure sounds like a great idea. Rather than, here's their other tactic. Well, we're not implementing rent control, Shaun. We're simply giving cities the authority to do that. Dave and I both know, you give the city of Portland the opportunity to screw something up, they'll do it 100 times out of 100 times. And they'll probably do it better than we ever imagined in screwing it up. They managed to do that with inclusionary zoning, which we knew was going to be a dismal failure, but most inclusionary zoning programs require that the affordability in there remain for 40 years. Some even require 50 years, and a lot of times you get federal tax credits for that. City of Portland said you had to maintain your affordability for 99 years. So very realistic for someone investing in a new property. So what did we see? House Bill 2004. Here's my plea to you all who are OIA members. Make Honeycutt get involved in this one. This took up 2/3 of my life last session in the long session. This was the priority bill for Speaker Kotek. The Speaker had a 35 vote majority in the chamber. It only takes 31 votes to pass a bill. That's a policy bill. We spent 3 to 4 months fighting over House Bill 2004. House Bill 2004 would have allowed rent control in local governments. It would have required relocation payments statewide. What else did I have on there? Oh, no-cause evictions were effectively gone. And the right of first refusal, this is a good one. So she thought that not only do we have a problem with existing landlords, but the real problem was investors purchasing buildings and fixing them up, because we shouldn't increase the quality of our housing supply. Also a byproduct of rent control if you implement it, because landlords don't make the rent necessary to actually improve the property. So part of the problem was people buying up existing units and fixing them up. So what she said is you had to pay a relocation payment for the individuals when you put them out. Then you had to keep track of that tenant. And when the unit came back available, you had to offer them the right of first refusal to come back to the unit. And if you failed to do that, then they had a private right of action against you, and they could recover 3 months' rent in the private right of action. I don't say this facetiously, I'm being honest. I have a client who owns a number of rental units around the area, including in Portland, and I said, if you buy another building in Portland, I will not represent you anymore. Seriously, if you got units in Portland, sell them. It really is that bad, and it's sort of, how do we keep that from pervading? They had similar language about the lease renewals too, that you were going to have to pay the relocation payments. It was interesting, the way they crafted the language in 17 was you had to inform them 90 days before the end of the lease, even though they should have known that when they signed the lease, and then they had the right to determine up until the last day whether or not they were going to renew it. They had to affirmatively tell you they wouldn't, or it automatically renewed. So the power shifted entirely to the tenant over the unit. And basically, fixed-term tenancies were a thing of the past if you couldn't actually control the length of time turning them over. So, bill comes out of the Housing Committee. For the realtors in the room, you probably know all too well that it was actually the 31st vote was one of our members, realtor members who's in the legislature, crafted the amendment, and it got out of committee by one vote, his vote. It got to the House floor, and it passed by a single vote. He spoke in favor of it on the floor, saying as a realtor he supported rent control and a variety of things. And it got to the Senate, and we lost it one more time coming out of a Senate committee on a 3-2 vote. By that time, we at least got rent control out of it. But many of the other provisions had remained. And ultimately, I think with 2 days left to go in the session, we killed the bill. And as I've talked to folks in the legislature who are passionately involved, I said, how about we focus on some of the common ground? How about we focus on this weird idea of just cause instead of just for cause and no cause, and actually figure out where we could work together rather than including rent control again, rather than having a giant fist fight. They're feeling a little emboldened now because they took out a sitting senator. They took great delight in taking out a sitting senator. When we had legislative days after the May primary, they actually brought signs that said Rod Monroe was first, who's next, and it had several state senators' faces on it. They broke into the Capitol before hours and put caution tape on all the perceived no votes on rent control and put eviction notices saying you're evicted from office. It's gotten increasingly difficult and petty, exactly. And that's exactly where Dave loves to be. He loves getting yelled at in the Capitol. Dave and I came out of a hearing where we were both getting screamed at, and he goes, I'm not used to that. I was like, oh, that's like every other day for me. I'm getting yelled at by someone. But Dave's the good guy who's helping small clients overcome big government. It's definitely been a big issue. Okay, so where are we at now? Well, as I mentioned, the advocates are feeling emboldened. The senator who took out Senator Rod Monroe is a woman by the name of Shemia Fagan, who is now senator-elect. She's a former House member. The Senate president is going to give her the gavel of the Housing Committee that he's newly created. And so we have the speaker driving this push. We have a committee chair who's driving this push in the House, and you have a committee chair in the Senate who's driving this push. I still think with all that, we have an opportunity to stop at least the rent control provisions, if not others. But as I've sort of talked to Senate members who are critical on the vote, I say, look, I know I'm going to get rolled in the House. I know I'm going to get rolled in the Senate committee. My one and only play is when it comes out of that committee and it goes to the Senate floor, and can I stop it? And unfortunately, that's the only way the speaker ever negotiates. You have to demonstrate to her that you can stop her, and once you do, then you can actually get a deal, which we've managed to do in 2016 and 2014. But this is really, it's going to be a bloodbath on there. I think I put it up there. Additional proposals from Portland. So Commissioner Udaley, not satisfied with just what she had come up with relocation payments and ending no-cause evictions effectively in Portland, decided that our two biggest problems remaining were security deposits, that they were too exorbitant, so she wants to put a limitation on how much you can charge. I think her original proposal was $600 total that you could charge. And then her second source of frustration is that good people are just being left out of the housing market due to discriminatory landlords, so we shouldn't be able to do background checks anymore before you rent. And Dave mentioned the U.S. Constitution. We've got a City of Portland Constitution. Felons are now a protected class. And Commissioner Udaley determined that there were a vast variety of felony convictions that you could no longer use as criteria. And in fact, you couldn't state that as a reason for not renting to someone. They included stalking, felony assault, and my personal favorite, felony breaking and entering. So someone is willing to break into someone else's place and steal stuff, but you can't hold that against them when you're going to rent your place to them, and of course they're not going to steal stuff. So that's been their big push. I think the city of Portland, they took a pause on it for a couple of months. They since have had an election as well. They have Commissioner Hugh Daly has a new advocate, and Joanne Hardesty, who's a former state legislator, and so she'll bring it back at the beginning of the year. That'll coincide right when the legislature comes in, and I think you'll see, quote, security deposit reform, as well as tenant screening be included in the bill as well. That's all I got, folks. As I said, there is no happy ending to this other than a black screen. I'm happy to answer questions if you have it, but I feel terrible leaving on that note. Yeah.
I guess my biggest question would be, these people are doing all this. Do they think the landlords that are trying to build these things for rental, they're just going to sit back and keep doing it? Don't they see that this is going to make everybody stop being landlords, getting out of the business, selling their property,
Yeah.
and then where are these people going to be?
And so the question, if you guys didn't hear in the back, is sort of, don't they recognize the repercussions of what they're doing, effectively stifling development or eliminating units? When the City of Portland ordinance was up, one of my points of testimony was you'll no longer see single-family residences for rent. Anyone who owns one is not going to be subject to all of these things. They're simply going to sell it. And so you're going to lose that opportunity for young families to rent a single-family residence. And we've actually demonstrated how many were formerly rental properties and have been sold since then, and it's been a significant number. I think because the multifamily market has been so hot in Portland, people are willing to take the chance, but even that's starting to dip now. And now when you start seeing rents coming down again, and we're still building that supply of multifamily that eventually not everyone wants to live in a high rise. I know that they can't quite grasp that either. You'll start seeing those companies that are building those have to give free rent and all the things they had to do just 5 years ago. And very much to Dave's point about Wells, no one came in and saved landlords during the recession when they were giving away free rent. I hope that there's some sense there, but I'm not optimistic at this point. Not with Portland and the House, at the very least. Mitch.
There's obviously a squeaky wheel group for the tenant side of the equation, and for years, to my knowledge, there's never been any really good, solid organization for the landlords representing them and lobbying for them. Is there something I don't know about?
So I would say that the best group as far as smaller landlords is Oregon Rental Housing Association. And they did a really good job of, when we had the bill in the Senate, coming pretty close to equal of testimony and in City of Portland, there was actually more landlords there than there were tenants, but the landlords were respectful and the landlords weren't screaming at people, and the landlords were being abused literally by an elected official. And so it's hard to get more of them, but that's sort of the short answer is Oregon Rental Housing Association does a pretty good job.
Do they actually have a lobbyist?
They do. They have a contract lobbyist who's worked on these issues with us for a long time. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
In the follow the money, who's really funding the Portland Tenants Union?
SEIU. SEIU nationwide is funding groups similarly to try and enact rent control provisions. And there was just a statewide ballot measure in California over rent control. It actually did get defeated, but it would have allowed all the local governments to implement rent control other than the ones that were in before, and it's almost entirely funded by SEIU, which is Public Employee Unions, if you guys don't know who that is. Yep.
What's the process of no-cause eviction?
So a process for a no-cause eviction right now, let's assume you're not in the city of Portland. If you've had a tenant in there for over a year, you have to give them 60 days notice. That's it. That's it. And if they've been in less than a year, it's 30 days. Yeah.
And then if they don't leave, you have to file a forcible entry and detain or an FED proceeding against them.
And if you give them a exactly, and if you give them a for cause, that's exactly what will happen too. They always almost universally fight it.
If the city of Portland continues with this, what's the likelihood of it spilling over into the, city of Beaverton, Forest Road, or neither?
Yeah, so the question for those in the back was, Portland keeps doing this, so what's the likelihood it will spread like wildfire? I think the fact that it's in the LA Times saying that's a great idea and other cities should follow should be concerning to others. There is now a Gresham Tenants United that they are generating. One thing I didn't mention about Portland Tenants United, they also organized a rent strike. So they had one building where they got everyone to refuse to pay their rent for 4 months. And we're generating a ton of media around it, trying to demonize the landlord. And the landlord finally issued the eviction notices for failure to pay rent and received death threats. So he rescinded those. Yeah.
Call me.
Yep.
Is there any group out there that represents people that rent homes that are happy to have a home to rent?
Oh, like happy tenants, you mean, basically?
Yeah, right. Glad that there are homes available to rent. Is there any group like that out there?
So the question is whether or not there's sort of a tenants group that isn't as disgruntled and angry. Not really. I think the Rental Housing Association does a good job with bringing the landlords in who, have a couple of units that their membership is almost entirely comprised of folks with 4 rentals or less. That's the vast majority. And they'll talk about, I haven't raised my rent for 10 years because I have a great tenant. And that's the huge misconception also in Salem, is that landlords just want to evict people for the fun of it. You all know landlords who have a great tenant, that's like gold. You're not going to do anything to upset a great tenant, and you're going to increase your rent as little as possible to ensure they stay there. And that story doesn't get told nearly as much.
How would you get that story out?
I think it's more than just, there was a social media campaign around More Housing Now. That was sort of the group countering what Portland was doing. I think there needs to be more of that in districts with legislators hearing from their constituents about, what it really is like, and it's not all just the bad actors. Unfortunately, the bad actors get a lot more of the press, and they're definitely the squeaky wheel. Yeah, so the question was about homeless folks. I would, if I were worried about homeless issues, follow the city of Portland's lead. They've done a tremendous job on No. Unfortunately, other than trespassing laws, I think, it's contacting your local sheriff if it's a more rural area about trespassing, but it really is just existing trespassing laws. Yeah.
Could a tenant and a landlord have a contract between each other that would not pertain to these laws?
So the question is, can you contractually opt out of the provisions that are in the statute? No, they expressly in the bill say that you cannot.
All right.
Yeah. All right, thank you all. I don't know, Dave, you got closing comments?
Just one thing. One thing before we're done. The moral of the story is where we started about an hour and 20 minutes ago, where I said never buy land in Multnomah County or the city of Portland.
Yeah.
That is the moral of this story. Thank you folks for being here. We'll see you next year.